Ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle, returning to the space station, paving the way for future missions beyond.
All right, everyone. It's Rick Caldwell with Caldwell Apologetics. Hope you're doing well today. Happy Thursday. We got an exciting live today. We're going to be continuing our study about the law with a little twist. Hence the title, Who Makes All Things Clean? So we continue our study in Mark, and the title of today's live is Who Makes All Things Clean? So that's what we're going to get into today. Hope everyone's doing well out there. We started our study in Mark this Tuesday, covered a lot of ground, looking at what does it mean? What does the law mean now that Christ has come? So that is what we're covering. That's the ground we're covering today. We're going to dive in here shortly. And look what we have here. We have federal ex-theology. Hey, how you doing, brother? How you doing? So we're going to be diving into this discussion as we think about the book of Mark and the ground we covered already. Let's think about the fact that now that Jesus has come, what is the role of the law? Now that Jesus is here, kind of a quick recap of what we covered. On Tuesday, we talked about the fact that now that Jesus has come, ladies and gentlemen, the law no longer plays the role of guiding us in an authoritative fashion, because it's Christ that the law points to. And we covered that. We looked at various examples. There are various examples. Remember, we looked at Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, we have the who? We have the rich young ruler. And then we covered Mark chapter 10. In Mark chapter 10, I'm sorry, let me back up. Actually, in Mark chapter 10 was the rich young ruler. Get that right. And in Mark chapter 12, we have the scribe. And then we also looked at the Mount of Transfiguration in Mark 9, where you had Elijah and Moses present with Jesus. And at the end, only Jesus was standing there. Only Jesus. And a voice from heaven says, This is my son in who I am, my beloved son in who I am pleased. Listen to him. So, conclusion. Even though the Gospel of Mark does not provide, I would say, an exhaustive theology on the law, there are implications about the relationship of the law in regards to the coming of Christ. And that's what we looked at on Tuesday. We want to continue to think about that in light of our discussion today as we conclude, hopefully, our discussion on Mark. And let's say we got some other people here. Who we got? We have, what up, people? And there's a good song about being clean. Yeah. I seem to recall there's this guy named K-Dub True that has a song about being clean. Anybody familiar with that one? So, with that being said, let's dive in. We're going to talk about who makes all things clean. Who makes all things clean? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay. So hope you have your Bibles, and we're going to dive in to this discussion, and we're going to pick up actually in Mark chapter 1. We started our lesson in Mark chapter 1. So we're going to pick up in Mark chapter 1. So let's go there. Mark chapter 1. And I want to pick up in Mark chapter 1. Let's pick up at about verse 40. Verse 40 in Mark chapter 1. So what I want to make sure that as we're following along is that Jesus does something interesting here in Mark chapter 1, beginning at verse 40. We have the introduction of a leper. And I'm going to read a couple of verses here. Then we're going to make some observations in the text. A leper came to him, referring to Jesus, imploring him, kneeling, said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him. Let me highlight this. Touched him, because we're going to come back to that. And said to him, "I will, be clean." Be clean. In fact, let me do this because I want you to see what I'm reading. There we go, so we can follow along together, okay? And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. All right. So we have the healing in Mark chapter 1, the healing of the individual with leprosy. Now, what's fascinating about this healing is Jesus touched the leper. And someone might ask, well, why is that significant? Well, it's very significant as we think about the law, as we think about the Old Testament law, and we think about purity laws, specifically purity laws. And specifically, as we think about the regulations around those who were unclean, specifically those who had leprosy, what the mandates were for that. And we see Jesus, who has the power to heal just with the pronouncement he could heal. Think about different examples throughout Scripture where Jesus healed individuals and he did not even need to touch them. In fact, there was one instance where Jesus, particularly, I'm thinking in my mind, where there was a centurion who had a slave, And that centurion realized that Jesus was a man of authority, just like he was a man of authority. And he knew, here's the fascinating thing, this Gentile, right? This Gentile recognized and knew that Jesus could heal even without being in the presence of his slave. So Jesus is not precluded to heal anyone because of distance or anything like that, right? Jesus can heal. Distance is not a limitation for Jesus. Also consider this, is that Jesus went out of his way to touch the leper. And I think that's very significant here as we consider what the Old Testament has to say about leprosy, especially in regards to the purity laws, okay? So I'm going to make reference to that quickly so we can follow along. Specifically, if you look at Leviticus chapter 13 at verse 46, Leviticus chapter 13, verse 46 says, he shall remain. Well, who's the he referring to? Let's go back a couple of verses. And it says in verse 45, it says, the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He, referring to the leper, shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. You see that? And that's why Jesus touching the leper is so significant in our study in regards of the implications of the coming of Christ in regards to the Mosaic law. I think it's very, very significant. You know, a lot of times when you hear people talk about this encounter, the emphasis is on Christ's compassion. And that's true. It goes back, let's go back to the text again in Mark chapter 1. It is true that we see the compassion of Christ here. And we see that here in the text. And we see that where it says, moved with pity, verse 41. He stretched out his hand. So we see the disposition of Christ. But I also think that we would be remiss if we don't see what is actually occurring here as well. Yes, there's a miracle happening here. But Jesus touched this man. And when Jesus touched him, this is so significant. Jesus was not defiled by this person. In fact, the opposite happened. Instead of Jesus being defiled, an encounter with Christ actually cleansed this man. Hence the title, Who Makes All Things Clean, right? He cleansed this man by simply touching him. In fact, he could have cleansed him without, as I said earlier, touching him. And I believe that what we need to take away from just this interaction, as I said, is Jesus could have cleansed him with a pronouncement, as he did in other occasions, right? Jesus could have taken precautions so that he could have been prevented from being ritually defiled, but he didn't. But when Jesus touched the leper, he was not defiled by uncleanness. Instead, the leper became clean. The point, the emphasis here is Jesus is greater than the Old Testament law, indicating once again that the law points to him and he himself is the fulfillment of the law. All right, so we have one example with the healing with the leper. Very significant here about this coming Messiah, about the Son of God, as it's emphasized in the beginning of this chapter. Another example I think is worth looking at is Mark chapter 5. So we'll turn to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5, I think, is also significant in this for this study. And we'll pick up at verse 24. Mark chapter 5, verse 24. And a great crowd followed him and thronged around him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. So I want to highlight this. And touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Right? Go in peace. Okay, so I'm gonna pause right there. We'll continue further in a moment. But just a few observations here with this encounter, with another healing of the woman with the issue with blood here. So we even have in this situation, right, the woman touching Jesus. In fact, the emphasis on the woman touching Jesus, who had this affliction for 12 years and had gone to many physicians, right? And not only did the situation not improve, it actually got worse after going to numerous physicians. And the emphasis on touching Jesus is so profound even in this text. Why do I say that? Look at the text again. Let's just look at the observations. The emphasis on touching Jesus. We see it here in verse 27. Touched his garment. We see it again in verse 28. If the touch, I'm just going to highlight that again. Emphasis on touch. Okay. I want to go and look at verse 30. Verse 30. Look what it says here. It says, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who, what? What's the emphasis? Touched my garments. So we see it here the third time, the emphasis on touch. But we have it again in verse 31. Notice what it says. And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 instances on touch, on the woman with the issue with blood, touching Christ. Let me pause here. Hey, brother, how you doing, Brother Rob? We got Brother Rob from the Love Agenda in the house. Many of you already know him, but if you don't know him, great brother, please subscribe to his channel if you have not already subscribed to his channel. Glad you're here. So once again, there's touch, but it's the other direction. Instead of Jesus touching the individual touches Christ. And so what are some of the things that we should consider here? Well, we need to consider the Old Testament law again. And the Old Testament teaches that a woman who has a discharge of blood is unclean. That's this emphasis on unclean, just like the leper was considered unclean, right? A woman who has a discharge of blood is also considered unclean, so that anything or anyone who touches her is also unclean. Where do we find that in the scriptures? Well, we simply go to Leviticus chapter 15. Let's go there quickly. Leviticus chapter 15, picking up in verse 25. Leviticus chapter 15. Notice what it says. It says, if a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity. So this is not just talking about menstruation here. It's talking about more than that, okay? All the days of the discharge, she will continue in uncleanness, right? You see that? As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of impurity, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. Right? You see that? So whatever the woman's unclean, and whatever touches her is also considered unclean as well. But what do we see here in the text? Going back to where we left off in Mark. Going back to where we left off in Mark, back in Mark chapter 5. What do we see? What do we observe in the text? What do we notice that has taken place? What does Jesus declare? That these are all important observations that we need to pay attention to. What does Jesus say in picking up by verse 33, the woman who confesses that she is the one who has touched Jesus, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, did he say to her, you are unclean and you have defiled me, woman? No, that's not what Jesus said. In verse 34, Jesus said to her, daughter. Now that's an interesting phrase or word there that's used, a term of endearment. Daughter, your faith has made you well. She recognized that coming to Jesus, remember what it said about her, the discernment she had? Let's go back what it said about her. She had heard, verse 27, she had heard reports about Jesus. The word about Jesus had gone to and fro. She had heard reports about Jesus and came from behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, think about this, if I touch even his garments, what was the conclusion? I will be made well. That means she went from hearing things about Christ, reports about Christ, and coming to a certain confidence, not just comprehending what was said, not just being convinced that they were true, but even to the point where she placed her confidence in the one whose truth was being presented. And that's why Jesus gave her this wonderful commendation when he says in verse 34, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Now, let me make an observation here as well. You should never use this text, as some do, specifically in the charismatic community, right? Many will use this text to try to say, well, if you don't have faith, then Jesus couldn't heal or healing couldn't take place. We're going to see in my next example, as we look at our next example very soon, And I can think of another one as well. I can think of several examples where Jesus is not precluded by the faith of the individual in order to perform the healing. Okay, let's just get that out the way. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Jesus is not the people's lack of faith doesn't stop Jesus from healing. Okay. And I can hear somebody saying, well, what about when Jesus went back to his hometown and it said, you got to read the text carefully. Okay. It isn't that Jesus couldn't heal the people. He chose not to heal the people because of their unbelief. That's different. That's a whole different situation. But it's important that we get that out the way. Okay. So let's not draw some erroneous conclusions here about what transpired. Yes, it's about this woman's faith, but it also is not a limitation of Jesus if one does not possess faith. Jesus is not limited at all. So I need to make sure that that doesn't get in the way of this discussion. All right. And that's a very important point of clarity. And so a couple of things here as we consider Jesus in light, the coming of Christ in the light of the law. All right. What we see here clearly is that Jesus, just like the healing of the leper, now that we have the coming of Christ, this is so important that we get this. Now that we have the coming of Christ, the role of the law has completely changed with the coming of Christ. And we see that in the interactions like this, even though Mark does not, and I want to repeat this again, does not provide a comprehensive theology of the law, we would be remiss if we don't examine or observe these important interactions about the law in regards to Jesus's public ministry. Let me press on to the next example here. The next example I want us to go to is as we just keep reading in the text, and we will see the next example I think is profound as well. So I'm going to just keep reading. So I'll pick up at verse 35. And it says, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house. Some said, your daughter is dead. All right. We have a dead person. Now I'm going to tell you this. This is interesting. All right. This person is dead, right? We're actually going degrees, right? We got the leper, we got the woman with the issue with blood. Now we have someone who's dead. The daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Like it's almost like he can't do anything. She's dead. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. And Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went where the child was. And check this out. By taking her by the hand, let me highlight that. Taking her by the hand. Think about why that's significant in light of what we've been covering so far. And think of the Old Testament mandates. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha, Kumai, right? Which means, little girl, I say to you, arise, right? And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. and they were immediately overcome with amazement. All right. So we have another healing here, right? But Jesus does something interesting here again. He touches her. Now, why is that significant? Why is that significant? We looked at the significance of touching the leper. We looked at the significance of the woman with the issue of blood touching Jesus' garment. Well, what is the significance of Jesus touching her hand? Anyone? Let me see if the live chat, anyone in the live chat knows. Why is that significant? Why is that significant? Before I give you the answer. Anyone? Why is Jesus touching this dead young girl's hand significant? Anyone? I think you kind of know where I'm going to go next if you've been following the trajectory of what I've been doing. Anyone? Anyone? All right, no one. What does it say in the Old Testament? Old Testament teaches that one who touches the dead is rendered what? Unclean. So we got the issue here again about purity and uncleanliness, right? Here again, right? So where do we find this? Leviticus chapter 21. Leviticus chapter 21. Right? Look what it says here. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, no one shall make himself unclean for the dead among his people. Right? Right? Except, and there's exceptions here, his closest relatives, his mother, his father, and so on. That doesn't apply to Jesus. He wasn't this young girl's relative. But then there's other texts too that we can look at. We can then even look at verse 11 in the same chapter that says, you shall not go in to any dead bodies or make himself unclean, even for his father or for his mother. See that? And think in Numbers, is it Numbers chapter 5? Numbers chapter 5, it says, command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp everyone who's leprous or who's had a discharge, or everyone who's unclean through contact with the dead. See that? That's why it's significant that Jesus touched this dead young girl's hand. Because according to the Old Testament law, to touch a dead person that would defile the one who touched them, right? But Jesus touched her. And not only was Jesus not defiled, the one who was considered defiled, this dead girl, came back to life. In fact, he told her, going back to the verse, going back to the text where we left off, back in Mark chapter 5, he says to her, little girl, I say to you, arise. Jesus did not have to touch the girl for her to do that. In fact, what is one of the signal examples we see in the scriptures of Jesus bringing someone back to life who had died, and he didn't touch them? Well, we know who that is. Lazarus. This is one of the signal examples. Didn't touch Lazarus. All he did was call out to him, and Lazarus came forth. So it wasn't necessary for Jesus to touch the young girl's body, but he did that. Again, the emphasis here. Notice there's a trend. Notice you see a pattern in all of these healings. The leper, the woman with the issue with blood, the young girl who had recently deceased, right? Right? What do we see here? We see that with the coming of Christ, in light of the law, what the Old Testament law says, that the law is ultimately subordinate, to Christ. And in our application of the law, now that Christ has come. He is greater than Moses, and we're going to see here shortly he's even greater than David. He's the greater David. We'll look at that example very, very soon. So I think it's really significant. Once again, even though Mark, as I've said many, many times, Mark does not lay out a comprehensive treatise on the theology of the law. There are implications about the law with the coming of Christ that we can't ignore. We simply can't ignore. Okay? So let's go to our next example. Our next example will be found in Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, beginning at verse 18. So we're going to Mark chapter 2, beginning in verse 18. And the issue here is about fasting. The issue here is about fasting, ladies and gentlemen. And notice these examples. I think these examples, over and over again, you can keep going back to the Old Testament, and we can see, in light of the coming of Christ, our understanding of the law must now be filtered through the coming of Christ. We must think of the law, the Old Testament law, Christologically. That's the point I'm trying to make. But here's a prime example of it even here. Picking up at verse 18, it says, "Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and the people came and said, 'Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?'" That's the question. Jesus, these other groups of people fast, but your disciples, Jesus, they do not fast. What is happening here? What's going on here? And Jesus said to them, notice what he says. This is quite interesting response. "Can the wedding guest fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast." And he goes on to say that the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. "No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch wears away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wine skins." A lot here to address. But I want to go back to the emphasis on his question, which is more of a statement than a question, to get them really thinking about what is transpiring here with the fact that, something must be amiss that Jesus' disciples aren't fasting. The question here about the wedding guest. It says, can the wedding guest fast while the bridegroom is with them? And obviously, this is a rhetorical question. Obviously, the wedding guest would not be fasting, they would be feasting. That's the point he's making. When the wedding guests are in the company of the bridegroom, there's no fasting. There is, in fact, feasting going on. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to emphasize here with this question or this interrogation that has been made, right? And so I believe that Jesus is even pointing to Isaiah 25:6. You can go there. I'm not going to go there at this time, but just kind of everything I'm trying to point out, I'm showing you, trying to show you at some level emphasis in the Old Testament scriptures in regards to things that Jesus is ultimately fulfilling and his coming. The fulfillment of God's promises do not call for fasting, but feasting. The fulfillment brought about by Jesus does not simply represent a patching up of the Old Testament legal economy, right? That's not what's going on here. In fact, that's why he brings out the illustration at the very end. Like it can be for some a very puzzling illustration when he talks about new wine and new wineskins. So the new wine, the new era of the coming of Christ is also accompanies a new understanding of our relationship to the law. And the point is, we don't have the old relationship of the law with the coming of Christ. We have a new understanding of our relationship to the law with the coming of Christ. Therefore, new wine can't go into old wineskins. That's the point Jesus is making here, trying to emphasize here. So once again, there in this exchange, there are important implications brought out about our relationship now to the Old Testament legal economy, right? Now that Christ has come. Let's see here. We have Rashad D. Howdy, y'all. Howdy, brother. How you doing? So I think this is very, very significant that we consider that, right? And there's a lot more I can say. My goal is just to kind of provide a survey, get you thinking through these issues. And there's always opportunity for us to have follow-up on each one of these points individually. I want to go now to the issue about the Sabbath and the same chapter, just a few verses. We'll pick up at verse 23. It says, one Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Okay, we got another issue here. First, it was the issue with fasting. Now it's the issue with apparently doing things that are not lawful on the Sabbath. And he said to them, have you never read what David did? Now we're going back to the Old Testament. Have you never read what David did? Surely these Pharisees have read. But I think what Jesus is doing here, and as we read, is connecting the dot that Jesus is the greater David. And they should know and be aware of what David did. He's going to tell them. He's going to say, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, but also gave it to those who were with him. Right? So that's an Old Testament account about what David did. And there's a parallel here. This is where I believe there's much teaching that needs to be done in regards to typology. How Christ here is the greater David. And even more so, because that's going to come out here. He says, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, this is really a compelling statement. This is to bring things full circle. That Jesus is ultimately declaring against the accusation of doing something unlawful, because he is even sovereign over the sovereign Lord, even over the Sabbath, that there's nothing unlawful that has been done. And to illustrate the point, he even goes back and points them to something they've read. They know, but they are not able to connect the dots. Just like so many who often go to the scriptures. Remember, we read in John chapter 5 on this past Tuesday, where we looked at John chapter 5 and how Jesus said, in there you search the scriptures, because in there you think you would find eternal life, but these same scriptures you're searching are talking about me. And in essence, when they say talking about me, you're not going to see the word Jesus Christ, but what you find either through the prophecies or through types and shadows, they ultimately point to the coming Messiah. And so Jesus saying, yeah, what David did, yeah, that was just a shadow of who I am. But let me declare to you that I'm the greater David because I'm even Lord of the Sabbath. And you got to imagine the reaction to that. But once again, just like I've been going through Mark, when you actually had the rich young ruler who had approached Jesus and he started with this statement, good teacher. Now, I had someone come to my channel, I'm not going to say who tried to say that I somehow was denying that there's one God by what I said on Tuesday. Go back and listen to what I said, okay? I might cut that out and just put it on my channel and say, did I deny that there's one God? No. What I said is that if Jesus never denied he was good, and if God alone is good, do the math. That's what I said, okay? Do the math here. If the Son of Man, referring to Jesus, is even the Lord of the Sabbath, do the math, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I got to say. I'm going to keep it moving, okay? But here is the thing. This shows us and demonstrates that even the Sabbath, how we view the Sabbath, must be interpreted Christologically. It must be viewed in the light of the coming of Christ. It can no longer be viewed strictly in the strictest Mosaic legal economy sense, because Christ is here. And so any interpretation, here's the point, here's the takeaway I think many people fail to understand. Any interpretation of the law, any application of the law must always be viewed or interpreted in light of the coming of Christ. Failure to do that is like putting new wine into old wineskins, okay? Now, with that being said, one more place I want to go, and then the lesson is yours, ladies and gentlemen. The lesson is yours. And where I want to go in Mark is Mark chapter 7, picking up at verse 1 in Mark 7. How are we doing on time? We're doing very well on time. My goal is try to get these live streams down to an hour. I think we're well on our way to do that. All right, so here we go. Picking up at verse 1 in Mark chapter 7. Now, when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of the disciples ate with their hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the traditions of the elders. Now, this is interesting. This is not the law of Moses. This is the traditions of the elders. And that's an important distinction we need to make, right? And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there were many other traditions. This is the issue. Many other traditions that they observe. Such as the washing of the cups and the pots and the copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? Question. And he said to them, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And this is important in light of what we've already highlighted earlier. This is an important indictment here. The doctrines, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For going further to verse 8, he says, you leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. The tradition of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father and or mother must surely die. Right? I see. So what he's doing now, notice what Jesus is doing. I've already pointed out very quickly from the text that this is business of hand washing before eating. That is not part of the law of Moses. That is a tradition that came after Moses, that referred to the tradition of the elders, right? Or the oral law that was given, right? After Moses. And this is what Jesus is excoriating. This is what Jesus is critiquing. This is what Jesus is addressing. But as he's addressing this, he says, by focusing on the traditions of men, you're neglecting the true commandments of God. And that's what he picks up here in verse 9. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, whatever you would have gained from me is korban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do. And why he says many such things you do, because we just read earlier that there were a multitude of traditions that were being done, that were being passed down, that had nothing to do with the law of Moses, right? Notice what it says earlier. We dealt with that earlier. And it says, and there are many other traditions that they observe. So these traditions have nothing to do with the law. These are man-made things that they created in order to put an even larger yoke around the neck of people, right? And what Christ is bringing out, it says, by introducing all of these traditions and appearing to be holy or righteous because of these traditions of men, you ultimately neglect the true commandments of God. And by making up things like this Korban rule, right? This Korban rule is a made-up tradition as well. Korban rule, I've dedicated the gold or these finances, right? So by dedicating them, I cannot actually do what God told you to do by honoring your mother and your father. In fact, if you go on and you read what Paul talks about, it, he says that those who do not take care, what did Paul say? Those who do not take care of their family when they can do it, they have the means to do it, is worse than an unbeliever. That's a scathing rebuke, right? So Jesus, in alignment with Paul, is bringing this issue to bear. You're making these excuses because you're hiding behind your traditions. And by hiding behind your traditions, you're actually violating the true commandments of God. And so he's bringing that to bear here. And so I find that fascinating as we go on. As we continue to read, he says, and he called the people to him again and said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand there is nothing. So what is he doing? He's dressing the facade of man-made tradition, right? This is why he's calling the people to him. This is not a whole new conversation. What Jesus is doing here is in light of the traditions of men that Jesus has addressed earlier. So he called the people to him again and said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can devour him, right? Wow, he's dealing with the earlier critique. He's dealing with the earlier critique. What earlier critique? Well, we've been following the text. What earlier critique? At the very beginning here, about his disciples eating with unclean hands, making them defiled, right? Because of the traditions of men that say if you have to wash your hands in order to eat. And if you don't wash your hands, you're defiled, right? He's addressing that, ladies and gentlemen. This is what he's addressing. And we go back down. He says here, hear me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him, right? It's not about the externals. It's the internal, right? It's the thing, it's the issue here is not the facade. It's not the pomp and circumstance. It's not all these traditions that make you look like you're something, right? The issue here that he's addressing, where true defilement is on the inside, right? And he goes on to verse 17. Notice what he says. And when he had entered the house and left the people, the disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, when are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile him? Right? So that means even the idea of washing, having to be ceremonially clean before eating the food, right? That doesn't defile a person, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach and is expelled. Thus, here's the commentary from Mark. Thus, check this out. In light of what Jesus said, thus he declared all foods clean. We still, notice, we haven't left the idea of purity or cleanliness. Still very front and center, a very important theme here in Mark's gospel being addressed, but addressed in light of the coming of Christ when we consider the Old Testament law. That's important that we see that. Thus he declared all foods clean. Notice he is operating from a position of authority. He's not just saying, well, it is written, thus it is written that all foods are clean, like a scribe would do. He would have to declare what's written. No, he is making a definitive, authoritative declaration, in essence. Well, that's the implication based on what Mark is seeing here from his explanation, that all foods are clean, because what enters the stomach does not defile you. What comes into the body does not defile. Hence, therefore, he is declared that all foods are clean, right? And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. That's the point Jesus is trying to make. Yeah, all these traditions and things that you've concocted, and all these different machinations, none of those defile you. It's what comes out of you that defiles you, because it comes from the heart of man, as he says here, out of the heart of man. That's the issue here in verse 21. So what are some things we should consider? What's some observations in light of this? Point I've been making from day one. The Mosaic covenant and its law no longer maintain the same status in this regard, since the food laws are no longer mandatory. New wineskins brought about by Jesus Christ replace the old wineskins. And that's the very point I'm trying to bring out here. And I'll just give us some closing comments. And then, ladies and gentlemen, the lesson is yours. So a couple of closing comments here. We must recognize that Mark does not attempt to work out for the reader a theology of the law. This is something I've been saying from the very beginning as we started our study of Mark. Since this is not Mark's purpose is what? The proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom and the coming of the Messiah, who is the Son of God. That is the ultimate trajectory and purpose and goal of Mark's gospel. But in light of the coming of Christ, there are implications in regards to the Mosaic legal economy. And we see that here just in all the examples we've looked at. And we've looked at a number of examples here, right? And so the Mosaic law, the important part here, is no longer binding since a new era is inaugurated by Christ. And at the same time, it doesn't follow that the commands of the law have no application for the believer. And I have to always say that because when some people hear me say this, new wineskins and new wine, at the very same time, we can't go to the other extreme and say that the Old Testament has no application. The Old Testament law specifically has no application for the believer, right? We even see when Jesus was even talking about the traditions of men, he brought up the need to honor one's parents. For this is part of Christ's law for the believer, right? It is Christ who's the one in Deuteronomy chapter 18 that said you would have to listen to him. As we looked at in Mark 9 on Tuesday, when the voice came down from heaven, this is my beloved son who I am well pleased. What? Listen to him. So now we are to listen to him, Christ. So this was all prophesied. We see that in Torah and Deuteronomy 18. It's brought to our minds again in the New Testament in various places like Mark chapter 9. And right here in these various interactions, we see Christ speaking from a position of authority saying, yes, this is binding, but whatever is binding whatever application of law is binding is always in light of the coming of Christ. It must be viewed and must always be considered in light of the coming of Christ. The application of any mandate that we have, any command, must always be in view of the coming of Christ. That's so important that we get that, right? Must always be interpreted in light of the coming of Christ, right? Now that Christ has come, the purity laws are fulfilled in him, signified by the healing of the leper, the touching of the woman with the flow of blood, and the healing touch of Jairus' daughter. So we looked at those three examples. The new wineskins have arrived in Christ, and thus the old wineskins of the law must be interpreted in light of his coming. Mark doesn't give us, ladies and gentlemen, as I've been saying from the very beginning, Mark doesn't give us a full picture of the whole theology of the law, but the picture he gives us fits the larger scene found in the remainder of the New Testament scriptures. And we've looked at various texts in the New Testament scriptures in regards to the role and placement of the law in light of the new covenant. So we've looked at various texts already, and Mark is in the 100% in alignment with what the rest of the New Testament scriptures teaches on this matter. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is all we have for this evening. I hope everyone was blessed by the study. We will continue our study on the law probably sometime next week. I hope everyone was blessed by this lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments, or you can send me an email if you have some questions. In fact, I know I get questions from time to time. I'd be happy to answer them in regards to what we've been studying. And so if you have any questions, I'm going to leave my email in the chat. That's my email address. Sometimes, it's best to, send me an email if you feel inclined. So there it is. So everyone, remember, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, we do all to the glory of God. Amen. Amen. God bless.